Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of CEO and Market Expert Interviews. I'm your host, Lucy, and some of you know me as Triangle Investor from X. Today, my guest is a very well-known nuclear name, Mark Nelson. Mark, great to have you in my show. Finally, welcome.
Thank you for having me, Lucian, and thanks for the persistence in keeping up. I'm finally stuck here in Chicago for a bit as I'm expecting my first child.
Yeah, congrats, by the way.
Thank you very
Uh,
much.
is it a boy or a girl? Just a
It's
quick
it's a
question.
boy.
Okay. Mark, let's start with quick overview of you and your career for my listeners who are not 100% familiar with you and about your background. So tell us more about you and what is Radiant Energy Group all about?
Radient Energy Group is my consultancy, and I have a technical background, so I studied nuclear engineering, and I'll get to why I ended up doing that.
Sure.
But I also have a background in writing and other things that are typically unusual for engineers to study and to engage in. Um, and because I got my engineering degree at a pretty rough time for nuclear, I ended up on a somewhat untraditional path. But going back a little further, I'm from Oklahoma City, Oklahoma, proper oil and gas boom bust town, most recently famous for the fracking boom. I have a dad in oil and gas, a petroleum engineer, and a mom in medicine. And I had no interest in either. And the conversation never came up of combining those two things. I studied at Oklahoma State University in aerospace and mechanical engineering and Russian language and literature. I was a confused child, didn't know what I wanted to do. Just know I wanted to do something big and exciting. And although I know some interesting people in wind power, it just never, I don't know, it just never did it for me, it didn't whatever imagination makes a kid want to go to space and found space colonies and fly fighter jets, that didn't apply for wanting to do wind turbines. So I'm trying to figure out what to do for graduate school. I have a scholarship to go overseas to Cambridge from an oil executive, and I didn't know what to do. Then a Canadian YouTuber, a gentleman named Gordon McDowell, puts up videos about nuclear reactors. He had a guy come and record a lecture in Calgary, and I saw that YouTube video. I got hooked immediately within minutes and I just decided with full naive confidence, I'm going to do nuclear energy. So what I think captured me about nuclear energy is that it was as important as it gets. It's energy, as all of your listeners are going to know, the foundation of society.
Yeah.
And yet it seemed like the difference between where we'd gotten in nuclear technology versus where we could get, that gap was so huge that surely you need another nuclear engineer to come solve it for you. So that was 2012. Went off to Cambridge, studied nuclear engineering, got my master's, studied advanced nuclear reactors and safety, and then came back to America, confused at why the nuclear plants were closing. Left and right, we were hearing about struggles, nuclear plants closing, nuclear plants running out of money. It was a really rough time, and I was trying to figure out how I could get into the industry. While I was unemployed and a little bit depressed about my prospects, I started charting electricity and carbon and trying to understand how the electricity markets were interacting with people deciding not to build nuclear plants anymore. Electricity markets are there. They act a certain way. It's very hard to understand. And then we don't build nuclear. That's what I was trying to understand. And a few of my graphs broke out of containment, private email chains. Somebody posted them on the internet. They went a little bit viral, and I was thrust into a public world having to defend what I'd done and explain what I'd done. And I ended up in the pro-nuclear environmental movement rather than in the actual nuclear industry. Went out to California in 2016, worked at the Breakthrough Institute and then Environmental Progress with Michael Schellenberger. And our mission from 2016 to 2020, when I set up my consultancy, was this. Nuclear plants were closing all over the planet right when it seemed we were about to need their energy the most. Why? And how can we stop it? And then let's stop it. That was the program. What I do with my consultancy is to try to understand the final nuclear closures ongoing throughout the world. There's only a few left. Most nuclear closures have been canceled or completed. And then next, now that most of the nuclear closures are done, What I try to do is understand how we get back to building nuclear plants and where it's going to happen. And if I can be involved, I get involved in getting nuclear added to a country. My clients tend to be in the nuclear space, in the nuclear fuel supply chain, nuclear technology. Although I'm famous for talking about the glories of traditional large reactors, I also advise and work with some advanced nuclear technology companies. And
Mark,
then I also do work for environmental consultancies that have a particular interest in understanding and supporting nuclear power.
brilliant, brilliant. That is very interesting background, and you sound like a very interesting guy, Mark.
Let's hope I can sustain it for your listeners. I'm sure they have high standards.
Yeah, they are having a higher standards. So you are in the nuclear energy sector for a long time now, would you say? So you have been all over the world. Would you say that the sentiment has changed globally for nuclear, and that the people, and especially politicians, are mostly aware that nuclear has to play the big role in the future to meet the demand for electricity and helping to achieve net zero?
Here's a sign of changing sentiment. You're calling me an old timer in nuclear because I've been thinking about it since 2012 and involved in it professionally in some way or in the periphery since 2016. And that truly does make me an old timer to nuclear by the standards of a hot, reviving sector. Now, that's hot, reviving sector in public interest and political interest and financial interest. It's not so hot and reviving as much as we need it to be in the actual construction and expansion of nuclear plants. And we're also not done solving this issue of nations closing their nuclear plants early. So I feel good that you call me old timer in the sense that it makes me feel good, but I feel bad in the sense that it highlights just how recent this turnaround in public sentiment is. In 2016, when I arrived in San Francisco, it made me a freak to like nuclear energy, and even more of a freak to be doing something professionally in nuclear energy. We've had a long period of time where young people who mostly aren't scared of nuclear would never have considered going into nuclear. It's one thing to not be scared of it. It's another to be aware of it. That's a hard hurdle. Then finally to not be scared of it and to be aware of it and to actually want to go into it. That is a very new, very hot change that I've noticed. Let me give you my very quick generational theory of nuclear sentiment. In 1939, we finally had a peace that would support the world after the horrors of World War I were fading into the distance. Oops, we didn't. Despite the blossoming of technologies around the world and the recovery from the era of the Great Depression, suddenly we had the most rapid advancement of science, of killing people, that we'll probably ever have. In 6 years, we destroy the notion that we're a peaceable species or that peace is politically possible. A bunch of people thought it might be, but no, we had the worst war ever, truly global war, escalating all the way up to the invention of a weapon so powerful that within a few years, it became clear to many people in the decision-making world and a few years after that in the public world that nobody would ever sleep safely ever again. No one could ever guarantee protection to the world because suddenly weapons were so powerful and so numerous that we could all kill ourselves. So with that, you had a new generation, the baby boomers, born into a world that was suddenly more peaceful than ever before, more prosperous than ever before, and seemingly hanging on a thread, dangling over annihilation. What a weird time, right? So if you're a young person growing up in the 50s and 60s and 70s, it seems like this world is going to get better except for one big thing. You've got to stop nuclear technology. You got to stop it from spreading. You got to stop it from existing. And this was something that was truly a universal sentiment among young progressive people around the world. Then you had deep confusion in decision makers themselves in the 70s and 80s and 90s. I've heard from a number of people growing up in different Eastern European countries in the 70s, 80s, and 90s that, well, it's not that they really hated or feared nuclear technology especially. It's just they could protest nuclear and the police wouldn't beat them. The police would beat them and arrest them. The secret police and the regular police would arrest them if they made political statements, but as long as they contained their protest to nuclear, that was somehow acceptable, likely because even the authorities themselves were not sure what they thought about nuclear after the era of 3 Mile Island and Chernobyl. So there was a really strong anti-nuclear movement years before we had the first great nuclear meltdowns. I think that's really important because I gotta emphasize this. There was an immense anti-nuclear movement, deep and strong, absorbing much of the professional and elite youth of the Western world before the famous meltdowns that people think caused us to turn away from nuclear. That's important because the meltdowns themselves were not that special compared to the way they were interpreted culturally. Right. So what happens? We have nuclear meltdowns that coincide with the blossoming and taking over of power structures by the anti-nuclear movement. Finally, you have a slowdown in energy growth and population growth in the West. And that happens at the same time almost everywhere except for a few still developing countries in East Asia that didn't have their own fossil fuels, slowing Western nuclear to an absolute crawl. Then 1990. I'm a 1989 baby. I'm 34, okay? I was born into a world that suddenly was no longer doing duck and cover drills, traumatizing the kids, waiting for fireballs that wouldn't save you, that you couldn't save yourself from despite following your teacher's instructions. So you had authority figures basically telling a generation of kids before me that you're going to die and there's nothing that can really stop you except if we do something which we clearly haven't done, get rid of all nuclear weapons. Then suddenly in 1990, 1991, walls fall, communism breaks, Soviet Union falls apart. And there is a reduction in numbers of nuclear weapons, but more than that, there's a spectacular change of interest in what is going to cause the apocalypse. It goes from one shared global nightmare of nuclear war, and suddenly that nightmare stops being handed on to the next generation in the 90s, 2000s, and the number of different things that young people might worry about ending the world is now vast compared to before, and nuclear war is just not that high up, and it's not that emotive for most of us young people. It's just as dangerous as before. That's the irony.
Yeah.
But we've lost our focus on the nightmare, which wasn't clear we could do anything about anyway, and we have new nightmares like climate change, ecological collapse, runaway viruses, AI. I mean, there's so many things to be scared about. Here in America, we have duck and cover drills, live shooter drills, right? There are many things to be afraid of and not enough time in the day to be afraid of nuclear war too. That generation, the millennials, rise up, advance in their careers, one at a time discover nuclear energy, one at a time discover climate change, and suddenly you have a generation of young people coming into their own in their careers, taking on more responsibility, entering politics, making media, having their own kids, without the in-baked, the really deep-seated fear of nuclear energy. And that's the moment we've arrived at now. Fukushima Daiichi was enough to really disturb a lot of countries still run by boomers because it reactivated those old nightmares. Countries at no risk of tsunami or earthquake decided to strip out nuclear because of Japan's experience when even Japan didn't decide to strip out nuclear. Isn't that ironic? Yeah. But for the countries either run by young Gen Xers and elder millennials, or the institutions where millennials and young Gen Xers are taking hold and doing a lot of the day-to-day work, to say nothing of the Zoomers behind us, the nuclear fear is breaking. The anti-nuclear fever is breaking. And the big middle that maybe has some thoughts, but doesn't really carry their weight, just wants to get through the day and do a good job and be agreeable, that soft middle is switching from thinking to be polite, I have to not like nuclear. They're switching around to be polite and reasonable, I have to like nuclear. Because wild people like you, maybe like me, are louder than the anti-nukes and seem to have more compelling arguments. I've heard anti-nuclear arguments that were correct, and I've heard pro-nuclear arguments that are wrong. On balance, clearly I like nuclear power, but the more important thing is, with the decline of nuclear fear, the rise of generations that were not indoctrinated in nuclear fear, you're getting a natural rebound towards this energy source where people who grew up like me, not knowing about it, realize the difference between what we could achieve and the little we've already achieved. So yeah, sentiment's really good. Different places are experiencing their own version of this at different speeds. I'm sure you'll get there in this interview.
Yeah, you sum it up really good. I want to touch already on the nuclear waste as well. You didn't touch on that. So is the nuclear waste, Mark, is it a problem or is not a problem? What's your take?
I'm glad you asked this, because even among people who are finding their way to having a pro-nuclear stance, voting for pro-nuclear politicians, and spending a lot of time learning about nuclear energy, the number one lingering concern that I would say is in the spiritually anti-nuclear realm. So, for example, saying, I think nuclear is bad because it's too expensive, that's sometimes that's hiding an anti-nuclear fear, but a lot of times I'm meeting people who are not afraid of nuclear. They just literally think it's too expensive.
Yeah.
That has to be answered through business arguments, technical arguments, electricity arguments. That one's trickier. But what I love is when people say, okay, I think I'm getting there on nuclear energy. I'm just really worried. What do we actually do about the nuclear waste? I love hearing that as a question, because it has the easiest answer of pretty much any objection about nuclear energy. And the answer is no, it's a fake issue. It's an op. It was fake news, if I can use that phrase.
Sure.
What we do is that we leave, for now, meaning first couple hundred years or whatever, we leave the spent fuel on site with the reactor that made its electricity money using that fuel. What you then do is, when you've got it on site in those dry cask storage devices, what is this? It's a concrete bucket, a few meters tall, with a steel liner inside, a few meters tall, containing the nuclear waste bundles, a few meters tall. These things are all sealed. They're 100 tons. They just sit there. They don't move. They don't have moving parts. They just sit there sealed, okay? There's nothing exciting and there's nothing interesting about them, but maybe that's the problem. We have almost always banned people who visit nuclear plants from getting to go see and touch these waste canisters. It's not dangerous. You're allowed to do it. You can go in there pregnant. There's nothing actually stopping us in either the rules or good safety guidelines from bringing a lot of the population into nuclear plants and letting them see nuclear waste. That solves it right there. If you let people see nuclear waste, that's going to take care of it. In fact, if you let people see pictures of other people getting to see nuclear waste, that should solve it too. My personal suggestion to nuclear plant owners, if they want to solve this once and for all, is to commission artists to paint the concrete outer, maybe solid colors, or you could maybe get a license agreement with a estate of modern artists and do those lines like a Mark Rothko, or you can see if there are sort of counterculture beverage companies that would pay to get like their brand of like startup microbrew painted on the outside of fuel containers. Doesn't matter. I'm not that picky. I would like it to be done well with a high degree of skill, but just paint your canisters, paint your waste casks, and then we will solve this issue. The physical issue is fake. Is the nuclear fuel dangerous if you were to approach it without shielding, break it apart, and rub it on your body? Yeah, don't do that. But that's true with a great number of materials all around the world that we are perfectly fine keeping people away of. Somehow only nuclear waste has some special spiritual fears, this spiritual pollution that people think we have with nuclear waste. We actually do have to address that, but it's not the engineers and it's not Yucca Mountain that solves that. I'm going to fight Yucca Mountain like any good anti-nuke. I'm going to say I'm against you that I think nuclear is good and you think it's bad, but if you're going out to protest Yucca Mountain, I'm going to find my way to take me and my team out there and protest Yucca Mountain with you. Yucca Mountain, of course, being the place that the US government had planned to store nuclear waste underground, thereby saving 0 lives at a cost of, say, $200 billion. That's what I mean by fake. Totally fake. So, nuclear plants make communities rich. nuclear plants in high energy price environments make companies rich. Just keep these simple little waste casks next to the nuclear plant. And if you think that in 300 years you're running out of parking lot space, just stack them double high or something. It's not rocket science in the most true sense of that word. It's not even nuclear science. It's just stack the containers if you have to. You probably won't for the first couple hundred years of the nuclear plant operating. And then you just decorate the canisters to something important to people, either locally or at your company, to show you appreciate the uranium for having served so well in the reactor. That's how you solve nuclear waste.
That's a very good answer. Mark, we are really entering the nuclear renaissance with more than 60 reactors under construction, some 120 planned, and more than 300 proposed. And of course, we have already 435, 6 in operation as we speak. Those numbers are really big, but actually we could see a lot of more with COP28 numbers, and the US plan to build much more reactors at a faster pace than planned. So my question to you, Mark, is this growth realistic financially, operational, and in other ways, especially for the countries that are not so rich like the United States or China?
Right. So those numbers are real. The problem is, as good as that sounds, it's not enough for nuclear to do much more than maintain its energy share in a lot of the countries that are looking to add it.
Yeah.
It's the triple nuclear pledge that you referred to, announced at COP28. It was brilliant. I didn't have access to the event because I didn't have a pass to get in that day. I got in after that, but I heard all about it. I was out there tweeting. I was thrilled about it, like so many other people were, and more countries have continued to sign this triple nuclear pledge. The numbers you cited, about 60 under construction or 200 planned, that's not enough for our triple nuclear pledge. We got to do quite a lot more soon to meet that pledge. So what you're calling a renaissance, first of all, say I entered nuclear right as the previous time people called it a renaissance was failing. Now, I think that we have much better conditions this time for this renaissance than we had before. Of course, that's hindsight. I'd like to think that we have more agency and more generational momentum, as I described previously, on our side for nuclear energy this time. And hey, we've got you and me and so many others fighting for it. However, the numbers you cited, that's good. It's not enough. There is the money for the ones you cited. The numbers you cited, that is gonna probably happen and get done.
Mm-hmm.
What we need, though, is vastly more. So, for example, in America, we suddenly have a level of electricity demand that many people working in electricity have actually never seen in their careers. It's only the old timers that remember the old days of growth. And even then, a bunch of the old timers entered electricity after 1973, when all of society was starting to experience an end to the exponential. So all of rich societies were starting to experience an end of the tailing off of the exponential growth that had defined the booming decades after World War II. So having said all that, what do I think we can do about it? I think that the West needs to coalesce around a tiny number, like fewer than today, of standard designs. And I think that countries need to do what they have proven they're extremely good at. And I think that we need much more cooperation between countries. And by the way, the countries that are not cooperating say we need much more cooperation between countries. So it's much easier said than done, I have to admit. But I think that a sort of new, I don't want to say nuclear Cold War, but a new sense of competition with China and Russia has happened in South Korea, Canada, France, USA. There's a sense that we've lost something and they've gained something in nuclear energy. And we can discuss Russia and what they've done, how they got there. But the US has fallen behind after inventing almost all the key technologies that drive nuclear power today. And we still fell behind. Partly it's because our elites turned against nuclear, lost the attention, and weren't there to support it when it needed high agency elites supporting nuclear during the bad times. But that's starting to come back again. the COP28 pledge was an excellent symbol, but it wasn't itself the building of new nuclear reactors, if that makes sense. COP28 announcement to triple nuclear, that absolutely is having big effects in governments around the world, but it's like people going out to warm up engines, starting the convoy, not yet driving out on the road, if that makes sense.
Yeah, you mentioned Russia, and you lived in Russia in one period of your life. How are the Russians actually playing their nuclear renaissance? And do you believe that they will have to adjust their plans because of the war in Ukraine?
I spent 2 summers living and studying in St. Petersburg and another one living and working in Tajikistan,
Mhm.
a country in Central Asia that was part of the former Soviet Union. At the time, I didn't know that I was living in a city powered by Chernobyl type reactors. St. Petersburg is powered by, even today, by Chernobyl class RBMK reactors. And I didn't know, nobody ever mentioned it. I didn't think about it. And then it was only later that I looked back and realized what must have been starting to happen. 2008, 2009 was a period that the broken pieces of the Soviet nuclear enterprise were truly starting to come back together and coalesce. For those who don't know, Russia dominates the world of the global scene for nuclear exports. That is a country that can build nuclear, building it for another country. It's just dominated by Russia. Russia is either recently finished building or continues to build or is about to build in countries as different as Bangladesh, India, China, in Russia, of course, Belarus, Turkey, Egypt, now Uzbekistan they're planning, and until recently, several countries in Eastern Europe were planning to get Russian reactors. If I did not have US citizenship and I were asked to be an advisor to a country, and people say, who treats us well, does a good job, like they say they're going to do it, and can just start moving. Well, the US isn't quite there yet. The Russians are there with nuclear energy. Now, I don't know if I would want to be a young Russian nuclear engineer forced to go out to the desert or, lose my job or get into trouble or whatever. Rosatom has to take on projects that they are told to take on. That makes a different environment than private companies that have the choice to pursue or not pursue projects based on the perceived risk and reward. So I don't want to say that this is something you can do in quite the same in a for-profit environment, but the U.S. government has interest to see that our allies have the option of getting nuclear power from America if they so choose it. We're still struggling to get up to speed to match anywhere near what countries can get from Russia. The Russian technology is perfectly fine, shares a lot of attributes of American technology. They saw what we did and they were able to develop their own versions of it. And they even made some improvements here or there, depending on who you ask in the engineering world. The Russians also have several advanced reactor programs that are going faster and have a longer pedigree than ours do. They have sodium fast reactors that so impressed the documentary filmmaker Oliver Stone, who now famously went there and got a tour provided by Putin's support to see the advanced reactors in Russia and then to come tell the world about it. So, having said that, there's nothing written in the stars that a strong Russian state-supported industry has to keep beating America. There was a time when then American astronauts had to ride up to space on Russian rockets. Yeah, SpaceX is they're going to be able to do things that Russia will probably never, ever be able to do with rocket technology. I'm willing to put good money behind that bet. But we're not there yet in nuclear. We don't yet have the SpaceX of nuclear that can compete with what Russia's able to do by sticking to their word, offering good deals on good terms, and executing it competently with excellent people on time and probably nearly on budget. So here's another thing I noticed when I've met Russians. There's been a major breakdown in Russian relationships with the Western nuclear world. They were friends and partners and colleagues and competitors at all the nuclear events of the world, and there's really been a bifurcation in the nuclear world, and the relationships have broken, and people on both sides are just saying, for now, we just got to go our separate ways. it's above our heads. The political disagreements, the war in Ukraine, we can't do anything about that. We just have to stand away. But of course, the fact that the war in Ukraine has picked up nuclear energy elements, that the largest nuclear plant in Europe has been captured by an invading army, that was a shock and dislocation in the nuclear world that went beyond merely not wanting to get involved in some beef between Ukraine and Russia. That's considered quite bad behavior, to take another company's nuclear plant and operate it for yourself. Utterly unprecedented. This is going to be an issue for Russia in repairing these relationships, even when hopefully the war stops. So what I wanted to say is, when relationships were better, the thing I noticed when I met my Russian counterparts, young people like me, people in comms, people in engineering, older people, is that they were, like, in many ways a cut above anybody that I'd met in an equivalent position in the US or European nuclear industry. Like, the executives had more riz. That's the kids say that now. It means charisma. People seem to have more snap. The absolute top of the top institutions sent people into the Russian nuclear industry. All the young people my age had excellent, if slightly odd accents in English. Like, they all had very professional English with a slightly odd accent that made it clear that they'd never lived in America or in an English-speaking countries, but knew it fluently. Just the best marketing. The best Twitter game was the Russians. They were the best at small modular reactors. They were the best at selling and delivering large modular reactors. And that comes down not just technologies that sell themselves and build themselves, comes down to people. And until we see that and are able to either recruit or just naturally attract through cultural revival of nuclear energy interest, until we're able to get that level of person into nuclear, we may struggle to execute as well as they do. And it distresses me as a red-blooded, patriotic American. I have no Russian background in my family. I had no reason to choose it as a language other than vague interest. I play piano and I like Russian piano music. So growing up, so I decided to study Russian when I had a chance to take the language last year of high school. That's all. That's it. It just happened to put me in a position where I could see just how good the Russians were, who were the counterpart to me and my peers in our jobs.
Got it. Just quick return on the reactor designs. So you don't see actually big differences in Chinese and Russian design compared to the Western design in terms of
No.
security technology.
There is a difference. America has many disadvantages that we're trying to overcome. But make no mistake, the leading light water designs available from Western vendors, well, US, Canadian vendors, shall we say, are the best. It's just we've hidden it by messing up the construction of the first of the kinds. So let me put it this way. If China, which can build almost anything, takes double their normal amount of time and more than double their normal amount of money to build their first effort at art designs, that can hide the fact that the designs are actually amazing. It also is interesting that our Vogel projects that were way over budget and way over time were not that much over budget and not that much over time compared to China attempting to build the same reactors. The difference is China has continued to choose to pay money to America and Canada to keep building copies of the AP1000 reactor from Westinghouse. There's a reason they're doing that despite having access to all of their own technology without having to pay anybody a license. It's because it's the best. It's the best in performance of any new type of reactor the world's ever seen. Straight out of the gate, the AP1000s are extraordinary, and it seems at the moment, I'm going to hedge because we don't know what the future holds.
Sure.
It does seem like they're going to have among the lowest operating costs of any designs ever made. What people don't understand is a lot of the so-called safety improvements of the AP1000s were actually making simple changes in order to eliminate complexity in the design. All of these are advantages that are easy to hide when you mess up the building process. If you get the building process right, we may actually be able to regain our edge if we cooperate together, have our best people get into nuclear construction, have the finance community turn towards new reactor, and continue to have the level of support that, for example, in America, we have from both sides of Congress, continuing to support vast sums made available to anyone who's willing to start building nuclear plants in America right now.
Yeah. Mark, I want to hear your comment about owner of 3 Mile Island reportedly is in talks about potentially reopening nuclear facility. How realistic that scenario really is, in your opinion?
Well, let me just say this. Different countries shut down nuclear reactors different ways. In America, as soon as you shut down, sure enough, you give up the license. And we have not yet seen an example of a company that gave up a license to operate a nuclear plant, who's told the Nuclear Regulatory Commission we're done, and then has gone on to restart it. But the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has made it clear that nothing's stopping you from reapplying for a license to keep going. It's just about, have you destroyed way too many irreplaceable parts or unfixable parts of your reactor? So at possibly the country's most crucial nuclear plant, Indian Point, just New York City, where we want to have one of the greatest energy deficits in the world, where you have people who need power and heat and light, and we don't really have that many ways to get it to them. We really needed that nuclear plant. As soon as that nuclear plant was shut down, they started ripping it to shreds. But that's apparently not what's happened at 3 Mile Island. One of the ways of dismantling a nuclear plant is to just kind of like you're mothballing. You just wait as the natural radioactive decay takes place that makes it easier and less tricky to dismantle the reactor without irradiating your workers. It's not like a super dangerous thing. It's just like a convenience thing where if you're trying to control doses to be small as possible and you're cutting and stuff, why not just wait a while?
Yeah.
So it turns out that waiting a while may look a lot like mothballing, and we may be able to bring it back. What's happened is that we have an extraordinary new situation in power where it's not just that there's demand growth. There's been periods of demand growth everywhere. It's that the demand growth is specifically companies that have gone from lying about where they're getting their power, telling the public they're getting it from renewables with these certificates, even though they weren't. But now they need like 10 times more for the same type of facility, 10 times more power. And there's not any way to lie to the public enough with those renewable certificates to fake their way out of the problem. They have a physical deliverability problem. They actually need nearly like half or even a whole nuclear reactor just for a single data center. And these data centers, they're not flexible load. If they're going to spend 20, 30, 40, $50 billion on a data center that only uses a few $100 million of electricity a year, you think they're going to turn it down a bit, lose a few hours here and there? No, these are going to be on all the time. Yeah. It's other people are going to have to turn down their needs if they didn't buy power as expensive as these data centers did. And the data centers are discrete locations. They're not like out there spread about here and there and next to that power plant and next to this power plant. They need to be a specific location. That means they're going to end up being placed next to nuclear plants that already serve customers, and those customers are going to have to find new sources of power. So one of the only ways to not just kick everybody else off the power, the power from the nuclear plant and serve a new data center is to restart a plant that had already shut down. Now, would it have been nicer to have kept it going in the first place? Well, yes, but the tech companies, they weren't ready then. They were offered this power and they turned it down. Let's just be clear about this. The tech companies were offered the clean nuclear power that they were actually using anyway. And they said, no, we'd rather use fossil fuel power while claiming that we're powering it with renewable energy certificates from the other side of the country. They chose that and watched our nuclear plants close. Well, now things have changed. People have claimed that nuclear is good now. They've discovered it. They've just discovered it. It coincides with discovering that they need a nuclear power reactor's worth of power at a data center. But sure enough, better late than never. They've decided they actually do need the nuclear plants, and it may be enough to pay the couple $100 million more than it would have cost just to keep the reactor running in the first place. But 3 Mile Island coming back on is more than just a victory for the people of Harrisburg or the grid not having to kick some people off in order to serve new demand with the nuclear plant that's just switching their power from there to there. It's also a massive symbolic victory. Most people don't know that 3 Mile Island kept operating. I mean, most people don't know that Chernobyl kept operating, right?
Yeah.
But 3 Mile Island, at least, there's a chance of it coming back, and it's unlikely we're going to restart Chernobyl nuclear plant. Yeah. So if we can restart 3 Mile Island, it's going to be a continuous stream of did you know? Or funny fact, 3 Mile Island, famous for meltdown, is coming back to service, and it's going to raise this question of how are we so scared of nuclear meltdowns if the plants keep operating and aren't like dead zones? Like, how can it be that we keep operating nuclear plants after they supposedly blow up or melt down or can't be accessed for 10,000 years? 3 Mile Island coming back will be incredible for this reason, this story.
Agreed. Mark, we touched on the United States, we touched on the Asia, on Russia. We didn't touch on Australia. What's your take on the policy change when it comes to nuclear energy in Australia?
So one of the things we pride ourselves at Radient Energy Group is knowing as much as possible about nuclear wherever it's being discussed anywhere in the world. Australia has no nuclear power plants, though it does have a large, important medical and research and scientific reactor, but it doesn't have any nuclear power plants. Still, the discussion there is fascinating to me because it's one of the only advanced, rich nations that doesn't yet allow nuclear power plants to be built. So I went there a few weeks ago, and I wanted to hear all sides of the story. I wanted to hear the sitting government side. I wanted to hear the upstart independent movements opinions. I wanted to hear the scientific researchers who say that we don't need nuclear in Australia according to their models. I wanted to hear the old grid guys who say that you do and they don't need to see those models. They have their own models that they trust, that are rule of thumb based and experience based and practitioner based, that say Australia does actually need nuclear. I wanted to hear from people on the street that are just caught in the crossfire. I wanted to see what the media sounded like. If they asked me to go on, I went on. You know, how often are we in Australia? If I get asked, I'm going to go.
Please tell us what you heard.
Here's the thing. There is an actual analytical nerd dispute about whether Australia needs nuclear power to decarbonize prosperously. Most of the noise, most of the debate is way dumber than that. When the coalition, that is the conservative coalition that is out of power, announced their nuclear plan, the response from the other side of the aisle, a lot of the people in the sitting government, was to put Simpsons, pictures from the Simpsons, the TV show Simpsons, like the three-eyed fish, out on their official communication platform, saying, the other guys want you to have three-eyed fish. It was one of the dumbest, stupidest, most childish things I'd ever seen. The big thing is that both sides of the political aisle seem to be convinced by their own political pollsters and consultants that nuclear is a winning issue for them in the next election, which will be sometime in the next year. Well, they can't both be right. One side is wrong in thinking that nuclear is a good issue to run on. The conservatives think it's right for the country and that voters will reward them for it. The liberals, the left wing, thinks that Labor government thinks that nuclear isn't needed or is dangerous for the country and that voters will reward them for stopping it and insulting it. I think that Labor has made a miscalculation here, and that's to say nothing about the scientific dispute, the energy nerd dispute about whether Australia does or doesn't need nuclear. I happen to think that Australia is in a much better position if it's ready to execute a nuclear program than if it is not ready. And I think that Australia would benefit from actually executing that program. My view is that we've had such a shocking change in how electricity is expected to be used in the future in the last 12 months. That for Australians to say, oh, we looked backwards at the way things were in the past and then projecting that into the future, we think we don't need it. That's foolishness. To think that you are going to power sudden anything that comes up, like a new gigawatt or 2 or 3 gigawatt demand in one location, if that's what's coming, to stay at the edge of technology, to achieve AI sovereignty is the phrase that I've heard going in the countries that don't yet know whether they have enough power to compete with America's coming hyperscalers. If Australia thinks that they can get AI sovereignty wrong or set that aside and not be ready for those crazy new energy challenges, and that the only thing in the future is going to be the past plus another 10, 20, 50 X increase in renewables, I don't know what to tell him. I just think that that's a dangerous bet. And all it takes is, say, mega transmission projects not coming in on time or on budget. Or it takes real difficulty integrating electricity into the life of consumers because of distribution network issues, not the transmission even, just the little lines and wires that go into people's home.
Yeah.
All it takes is a unlucky moment where renewables don't do a good job, but that even though you fix it later, you've still damaged their reputations. All it takes is the arrival of an anti-wind turbine environmental movement that we've seen drive wind additions to a halt in a shockingly similar country, Norway. By similar, I mean a big state that makes its money selling oil, right? That makes its money selling some kind of raw commodity that it barely even processes itself. That's Australia. That's Norway. In this situation, Norwegians are rich and they decided they didn't want wind turbines. So a giant organic citizens movement rose up and they hate wind turbines now. And they scarcely let any wind turbines get built. If that happened in Australia, it's going to blow holes in this delicately balanced plan that's been proposed for how to decarbonize without nuclear.
Yeah.
So I think Australia should get it. One more thing. Australia has claimed that they are going to be a responsible partner for the AUKUS deal, the Australia, UK, US deal, to get some of the most sensitive and high-performance military technology ever developed into Australian hands, the nuclear submarines. These are magic devices, a small modular reactor running on a microgrid, to use the buzzwords of the day in the energy space, powering a ship, providing the oxygen, providing the water, and providing near unlimited range and endurance without surfacing. That's sort of the ultimate trump card in defense. Well, are they going to be able to have that and have thousands? I've heard numbers like 8,000, 9,000, 10,000 people hired to help out with the nuclear submarine program without even having the nuclear energy program to go with it. In America, I don't really know what would happen to our nuclear navy if we didn't have incredible nuclear energy jobs waiting to pour money into the pockets of our sailors as soon as they finish their commitment on the subs and the surface ships with the reactors. Would we still be able to recruit people into the nuclear navy? Would we still have the technology base to run the navy? I don't know. And anti-nukes for a long time have claimed that we're only doing nuclear energy because it's a stealth subsidy for the nuclear submarines or the nuclear weapons or whatever. I think that's too strong, but it's clear that if Australia is going to have on a per capita basis 50, 60, 75,000 equivalent workers from the US point of view into nuclear, and they're not even going to have nuclear energy, that's really sketchy to me. Maybe they can pull it off, but I don't like the sound of Australia getting nuclear submarines without even exploring getting nuclear energy technology for civilians to go along with it.
Good point. Mark, one topic that we cannot skip, and that is Germany. Do you see Germany returning to nuclear in this decade? What are you seeing, hearing over there?
For a long time, Germany has decided that the way to prosperity was to have German companies employ German people powered by German energy in Germany. It is now becoming clear that German companies can continue to make plenty of money not being located in Germany and not hiring German workers and not using German energy. The reason I started my answer this way is because that seems to be giving both sides the evidence that Germany should or shouldn't have gotten rid of nuclear, depending on your perspective. For those who say Germany shouldn't have gotten rid of nuclear, they say Germany's hollowing out its economy, people are turning angry, prospects are dimming, they're gonna elect super intense right-wing governments to exercise the anger at what's been done to them. That may happen anyway at this point. And then meanwhile, people who say Germany didn't even need the nuclear plants, they point to the fact that German emissions continue to fall despite turning off German nuclear plants. Both sides seem to think they have the evidence they need. That's setting up a very strange situation where we're just waiting for elections to see which side is right. Having said that, I think Germany will come back to nuclear before the end of the decade. And if it does, it will be much better served by turning on the plants that are still able to turn back on quickly and cheaply, rather than simply razing them to the ground and starting over. Some of the key steps in this, and I'm working on this analysis with my team now, our third annual Germany reactor restart report is going to come out later this year. What we do when we look at this is we say, how many of Germany's reactors still have the license to keep operating and therefore are not allowed to start dismantling? It's nearly zero at this point. Last year, it was a bunch of them. They literally didn't have permission to start dismantling from the government. That keeps the reactor operators in their seats, along with the reactor in pristine condition. When you get permission to start tearing apart your reactor, it doesn't mean you do it instantly. It's not clear if German companies are hedging by doing a bit of this activity, a bit of that activity, but staying away from the parts that would be hyper expensive to fix if they started cutting. But then for those that did start cutting into different parts of their plant, we're going to catalog the work that's been done. Much of it's publicly available if you speak German and you go to the town hall and you read the list of announcements about what's happening that week. It's hard to do, but there are people that can help with this. You can see where the decommissioning stages are. In my opinion, there are still 8 reactors in Germany that would be less expensive to restore to operation than it would be to build new large reactors in their place.
Yeah.
Now, that's a big hurdle. We just talked about how nuclear is still expensive and we're not yet good enough at building it. But it's a decent way to look at it if we're going to see a reaction to the anti-nuclear governments come into office and change the law. Here's the situation. There's almost no law. There's only a few lines of a few laws that need to be changed. Very quick, very easy to reverse this nuclear phase out. The parties running for office on the right have said that they would do this if they get into power. They are much more popular than the parties on the left and center that are actually in government.
Yeah.
The German people are majority in favor of nuclear, though it's a kind of a soft answer because a bunch of them aren't quite sure what they've just done to themselves or what they really think of it. But we do a lot of polling at Radient Energy Group to try to understand this in as much of detail as we can without going there in person with a clipboard and doing a full psychological analysis of each German we talk to. We do polling that is as careful as possible to understand what these prospects are. That's what gives me the confidence to say, I think, not guaranteeing you, but I really think Germany will return to nuclear. I'm less confident, but still have some hope that they will return with some of the very same reactors they've just turned off. Many of the reactors Germany just turned off held the world record for best productive year and total lifetime output of energy. The Germans were extremely good at running their large, complex reactors. I think the Germans would be very good at restarting them. The conservatives have said they will restart all the reactors fit to run if they're elected into office next year. We'll see.
Yeah, we'll see, definitely. I have 2 more, Mark. The first is your tweet. I want to hear your comment on your tweet, and that is NRDC destroys nuclear, then blames AI for climate change. I want to hear your comment on that.
So for your overseas listeners, NRDC to us Americans is the Natural Resources Defense Council. It's a very serious name for a group of them. I don't really want to call them environmentalists, a group of friends and lawyers and concerned citizens who banded together to stop clean energy projects back in the 60s and 70s north of New York City. There were plans to put in a 2 gigawatt pumped hydro storage center, like a big battery powered by water, in order to be able to do black starts and make sure that New York City would be protected under power fluctuations. And it would also work really well with baseload power plants and provide millions of people's worth of response up and down, along with several hours of storage of that power, that level of power. So this group of environmentalists who, again, not really environmentalists, right? They didn't want the power lines. They didn't want to see them go over this mountain that's prominently on the shore of the Hudson River. They stopped that Storm King pumped hydro project despite promoting nuclear energy as one alternative to replace the pumped hydro at the time. They very rapidly, in the late 60s and early 70s, picked up the anti-nuclear spirit, and then they started attacking the Indian Point nuclear plant that had been built very close to where this pumped hydro was. From that beginning of fighting clean energy storage and then fighting clean energy, NRDC became one of the most prominent and definitely one of the richest environmental NGOs in the world. So in recent years, they were raising and spending over $100 million annually, some of that on trying to destroy America's nuclear plants, and always fighting to make sure that if nuclear plants were struggling economically, they were arguing that we don't need that power. We can do renewable energy credits, and we don't need that power on the grid. Losing nuclear power doesn't do anything. It's going to be replaced by renewables, so it doesn't matter. So the reason I commented on this yesterday is, although they've changed a bit, I've been told they fired almost all of their anti-nuclear staffers last year and just got rid of that whole part of their function. They haven't apologized. They haven't said we were wrong. We didn't mean, we forgive us. We're going to do it differently in the future. They just silently knifed their people and had them go away while still having the record of killing nuclear plants up to 2021, right? So what they did yesterday is they put out a paper saying we need our nuclear plants on the grid. If AI uses up nuclear plants, that's going to increase climate change. So what's so interesting here is, at first they say nuclear's bad, kill it, kill it, kill it. Now they say for the nuclear plants they failed to kill, don't let them power AI, they need to power the grid. Since they're one of the richest and best connected environmental NGOs in the country, it really matters that they've done, in the most chicken shit way possible, I have to say, they've finally admitted that nuclear energy is needed for carbon goals. This is amazing because they were the strongest and richest force attacking nuclear energy until very, very recently.
Yeah.
This is a sign that the tide is turning. I'm still really irritated that they don't have the moral strength. They don't have the courage or the character to admit what they did and to say that they were wrong and to say now we need to keep nuclear on the grid in order to keep the clean energy flowing. I'm not saying whether I agree with them or not on the AI issue. I'm saying they are hypocrites for killing nuclear plants, doing it themselves, celebrating killing nuclear plants joyfully in public. And now they're saying that the nuclear plants are needed, and if AI gets powered by it, we're going to lose that clean power.
Yeah. Let's conclude this interview with my last question, and that is, what's your take on the uranium investors?
So I have a lot of people who follow me who are in the uranium investor community. I don't really play in that world, but I will say I've noticed a change in the financial world because of uranium interest. That is to say, there's all these people in finance who weren't curious about nuclear, didn't know about it. All they said was, we don't do it here. And the greenies that we hire to write our ESG say it's bad. So that's it. We're done. Now they're saying, oh, nuclear is really interesting. And when I dig down, I often find that there was some kid, some summer intern or some junior staffer on the commodities desk at these big firms who had this keen interest in uranium from seeing it online and seeing the tweets. And they got their manager and their manager's boss and their boss's boss interested in nuclear because some kid would pop off and have a great summer messing around in uranium.
Yeah.
And even when there wasn't that kid, word gets out and firms had to know why other people were doing stuff in uranium. And somehow that's turned into a cultural force that's starting to transform the opinion of nuclear energy in the finance world, which is important for a capital-intensive industry like nuclear power.
As a part of that cultural thing, I agree with you. Mark, thank you for coming.
Well, then thank you for your service, and thank you to your fans for helping drive the nuclear energy conversation through interest in seeing the stocks go up and down. I mean, there are much worse ways to make and lose money that don't end up with the financial world aware of our greatest untapped source of clean energy.
Yeah. Mark, thank you very much for this conversation. It was great as I expected, and I hope we will catch up sometime soon again. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me on, Lucian. Talk to you soon.